Okay, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. I hope you're well. And welcome to our next installment looking at the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him. In the last video, for those of you who've been watching us live last week, we talked about the Prophet's ghazawat, and we discussed how when you study the ghazawat, this idea of the battles or the engagements or missions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that people have misunderstood what a ghazawat is. And so a ghazawat, just to reflect quickly before we move on, is any journey which the Prophet undertook, and it doesn't necessarily mean a raid. Right? A lot of people think that when they hear the word ghazawat, it means a raid by the Muslims or a war by the Muslims. So one of the meanings of this word is that the Prophet went out to call people to Islam, or he went with a group of people outside of Medina. So it has a number of meanings. What we can do usefully, and this is what I'm going to do in this video, is the Prophet's engagements when he left the city of Medina, when he left the oasis town, if you like, of Medina. You can divide them into two types. The first one is what you would say are preaching and making peace treaties. And I'm going to talk about this one in a moment. And it's very important that we follow these. And I'm going to give you their names and I'm going to explain a little bit about them. So the first type were preaching, and they were basically making peace treaties. And the second type, which I'm going to talk about in the second half of this video, is where there were attacks made on the Muslims, and there were a series of incidents during the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So we have number one, preaching and making peace, and number two is attack on Muslims and a series of incidents. I'm going to talk about the first one. Now, we talked about in the last video that the Prophet, peace be upon him, engaged in around, the scholars debate this, but engaged in around 27 ghazawat altogether, whether that was engaging in peace treaties, whether that was calling people to Islam, whether that was people fighting the Muslims, whatever it may be, there was around 27 of them. What we can say is out of the 27, nine of the ghazawat were specifically expeditions where the Prophet sought to call people to Islam, and where the Prophet sought to make a peace treaty with various tribes. In fact, in two cases, he was exceptionally successful. One of them, the Prophet made a written peace treaty. This is the first one with a clan. The name of the clan was Banu Dhamara. And the second one was in a ghazwa with what's called the Al-Ushayd. And he made peace treaties with the clan of Banu Mujlaj. Right? So the Prophet made alliances in the course of his expeditions. Right? And there was nothing aggressive in any of these. There was no aggression in any of these as well. So, in fact, in six of the nine that we're talking about here, the nine that we're talking about when it comes to preaching and making peace treaties, the Prophet didn't even meet them, right? In six, so we talked about three. In the other six, the Prophet didn't even meet these clans who he wanted to reach out to. We don't really have an explanation as to and so we don't really know as to why this was the case as well. And so often what happens is the Prophet will go out and they just didn't happen to be there, and somebody else came along. Okay. But the Prophet did not make contact with any of these six, and I'll give you their names just for completeness. The Buwat, the Banu Sulaym in al-Qudr, Dhu Amr in al-Ghatafan, al-Furu in Buhran, Zat al-Riqa, Duma al-Jandal. So these are the places where the Prophet didn't even meet them, but they concluded peace treaties with the Prophet, peace be upon him. In Zat al-Riqa, for example, the Prophet was traveling. As he was traveling to meet three particular clans, he met one on his way, and the other two were actually fearful of each other, right? And they actually made no contact with the Prophet. And the Prophet actually prayed for them, right? A prayer of peace, Salatul Khawf as well. So the Prophet sometimes would stay at these places. He never met them himself, but he would stay sometimes, for a period of few days as well. So he sometimes, whenever he would go out, to call people to Islam. So these are some of the ghazawat, and they're not actually forms of fighting, but rather calling people to Islam. Um, and remember that when Muslims, in particular, study the life of the Prophet, the primary reason they are studying his life is to learn from his example, his sunnah, his way, right? And so many early biographers, when they write about the Prophet, peace be upon him, they just describe his life, right? Um, but you do have some modern writers. For example, some scholars do write that the early ghazawat was to learn. So when the Prophet went out, or he sent people out, he sent companions out, was to learn about these new people, to learn about these new places, and also call people to Islam, right? And in some cases, one could argue, some of them argue, some of the modern writers argue, that it was an opportunity for Muslims to find out that these tribes wouldn't support the Quraysh. If war broke out, they wouldn't support the Quraysh in fighting against the Muslims, right? Sheikh Abu Zahra, a very famous scholar, writes in his book Sirah Khatam al-Nabiyyin, which is a biography of the Prophet. He only writes one sentence, in fact, affirming that the Prophet's expeditions were aimed at introducing Islam to the tribes, right? And so this was the case. Now the second category, and we've talked about 9 out of the 27 ghazawat were just calling people to Islam and making treaties. What about the remainder? This is where it gets really, really interesting. And hopefully in the coming weeks, I'll go into more detail in some of these in much more detail for you. But just for now, I just want to give you a brief overview of some of the attacks, some of the ghazawat in particular, not the 9, but the remainder, where it was on attacks on Muslims. So people initiated it against the Muslims, and there's some other incidents as well. The most famous one, probably in Islamic history, is the Ghazwa of Badr. This one took place in it's actually called Badr al-Kubra, because there's also another Badr, but it's called Badr al-Kubra, the Great Battle of Badr, which took place in the month of Ramadan, right? The background to this is that Qurz ibn Jabir al-Fihri, what he did was he raided a pasture of camels of Medina. So he raided a pasture of camels of Medina. And so what the Prophet did was, with 13 of the emigrants, people who had migrated with him from Mecca to Medina, searched for this person, and they reached a neighborhood of Badr, right? But they didn't find him. They didn't find this person as well. And so this is an example of the ghazawat, of the Prophet actually taking part in the search for someone who attacked with no reason, who raided the pasture of Medina, right? And so nothing really happened. The Prophet just went on. They include this. The scholars include this as part of the ghazawat. Though nothing happened, the Prophet just went out, peace be upon him, searching for this person as well. Now remember that the state of war had existed in Mecca between the Quraysh and the Muslims, and the Muslims had migrated, and so the Quraysh had effectively announced war against the Muslims. And remember that there are alleged intentions of the Muslims to take property of the Quraysh. So people say that, for example, they would attack the caravans of the Quraysh for property that Muslims had lost when they had left everything behind following persecution in Mecca as well. And remember that Abu Jahl, who was a very, very open enemy towards the Prophet and towards Muslims, he was determined, and this is really important, that he was determined to maintain his power, to maintain a sense of near complete domination in Arabia, right? And he wanted to show everyone in Arabia that he and his tribe were the ones who were in charge. They had control over everything, right? This is really important to understand, because this is political now, right? That they wanted to, and this is what countries do today, right? They want to make an example, remind everybody else that we're in charge, right? We're the superpower today. So Abu Jahl did this, or was intending to do this, in Arabia, and he wanted to ensure that nobody was seen to be competing with his power or the power of the Quraysh in Arabia. And so This is very important in understanding the conflicts that were to take place as well. So, for example, one of the caravans that was on its way to Mecca, because they had to pass around Medina, if you like, they sent a message to the Quraysh that they'd passed by Medina safely and they were on their way to Mecca. So they felt, the Quraysh felt in Mecca that this was an opportunity for them to annihilate and to destroy the Muslims. They needed an excuse, they needed a pretext to attack the Muslims. And so the two clans, Zuhra and Adi, withdrew completely from the march to Medina. So they were on their way to Medina once they were sure that their caravan was safe. Abu Jahl, however, he wasn't having this, right? He needed to eliminate the Muslims in Medina, and so he forced the Quraysh to advance to Badr. And his own words, Abu Jahl, he wanted the Arabs to hear about the Quraysh's march and their huge army, so that the Arabs would always be in awe of the Quraysh, right, forever afterwards. So he was very much determined, like many powerful states, to show their power, their raw power, right? Even though they had no reason to really fight the Muslims, right? In fact, Montgomery Watt, a very famous scholar, argues that Abu Jahl, for example, wanted to get rid of Muhammad, peace be upon him, once and for all, right? So they were determined to attack the Muslims. However, as we know, as Muslims now, we all know that they were defeated. The Quraysh were defeated. The Muslims had a very small group of men, a very small amount, and they were humiliated. The Quraysh were humiliated. It was a catastrophic defeat for them as well. And they lost 70 men in that battle. They also lost some of their leaders, such as Abu Jahl. So it was a huge defeat, a crushing defeat for the Quraysh, who were determined to attack the Muslims, right? And the Muslims had a smaller army, a far inferior army in terms of numbers as well. Therefore, the Quraysh, they did attack. This was really the first attack on the Muslims, if you like, at Medina, and this is called the Battle of Badr al-Kubra. That's one of them, and the Battle of Badr is a very important a turning point in many ways in Islamic history, and we'll come to that later in much more detail. Another one I want to talk about here is a place called Al-Sawiq or Al-Sawiq. Abu Sufyan, who had about 200, some say 400 riders from the Quraysh, what he did was he murdered. Now you can see that they are the ones who are being treacherous. They are the ones who are perpetrating violence against the Muslims. So he murdered 2 farmers, and he actually burned some palm trees and houses on the outskirts of Medina. So this is the next one. And the Prophet went out to them, but they'd already returned back to the city of Mecca. A few months later, in order to avenge the death of some of their people that were killed in the Battle of Badr, a group of Quraysh collected money from the revenues of a caravan after it returned safely. And this was actually for the one which they had gone toward Badr. And so what they did was they had the finance, and they prepared an army of around 3,000 men and marched to Medina. And this is in the month of Shawwal. This was a sad moment for the Muslims, where they were they found it very difficult. And this was the ghazwa of Uhud. This was the next one, the Battle of Uhud as well. The Prophet the next day, of course, went after them. They reached a place called Hamra al-Asad, and the Prophet and the companions stayed there for around 3 days, and they returned to Medina without meeting the Quraysh afterwards. And this is also a part of the ghazwa, even though the Prophet never fought in this ghazwa of al-Asad, this Hamra al-Asad, but they call it a ghazwa as well, right? And Ibn Ishaq, an early biographer of the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that this was to let the Quraysh know that the Muslims had not been weakened by their defeat at Uhud. And that's worth noting here, very, very interesting. If you read in the books, you'll find that despite that some of the enmity, some of the hostility that was emerging between the Muslims and some of the Jews in Medina, a wealthy Jewish rabbi called Mukhayrik actually fought and died with the Muslims. So there were Jewish people who actually sided and went out with the Muslims as well. And he actually died in a battle against the Quraysh at Uhud as well. And he's even reported in some places of seeking support of the Jews to support the Prophet, peace be upon him, against the Quraysh attack as well. So you'll find this in the books of Ibn Ishaq, for example, mentions this. Tabari mentions this, and other Orientalist scholars also mention this as well. Now, at the Battle of Uhud, just to refer back to that again, Abu Sufyan, who hadn't converted to Islam yet, he made a vow that he would fight the Muslims again at Badr the following year. So he promised that he would do this. So this was known, the last Ghazwa of Badr. That's why I call the first one the Ghazwa Badr al-Kubra, the larger one. And this was another Ghazwa of Badr. And the Prophet came there actually. But Abu Sufyan turned away before anything happened. So again, this is counted as a confrontation, although nothing really happened as well. So this actually shows that even though the Muslim scholars call this a Ghazwa of the Prophet, they did not see each other. So this confirms what I said last lecture, that the word Ghazwa was used in a very broad sense to refer to any trip or expedition of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And it does not necessarily mean that they fought or there was a sort of raid that took place as well. The next one is called the Ghazwa Banu Lihyan. This is another one that's important. The Prophet went out against the clan of Banu Lihyan, and what they did was the reason he did this was they assassinated someone who came out to call people to Islam at a place called Ar-Raji. So Prophet went out for them. He didn't meet them, so he returned back to Medina. So and again, this is another one where they never met, but they were the ones again who had killed an innocent Muslim. There's another one, Ghazwa Dhu Qarad, which is where Uwayna ibn Hisn from the clan of Fazara, who had a cavalry of the Ghatafan, raided basically some milch camels in a place called Al-Ghaba, which is on the outskirts of Medina. They actually even killed a man who was in charge of them, and they actually captured his wife as well. And so what the Muslims did, the Muslims came out, followed them, and freed the woman and some of the camels as well. 2 Muslims were also killed in this as well. So again, there were these instances that were taking place as well. It's just worth remembering that the emerging ummah state in Medina included Jews along with Muslims. It wasn't just a place where Muslims were living, Jews were also there as well. And so they had this new form of affiliation, which in many ways replaced the tribal clan system as well. So people had to abide by this political, economic, judicial system, which was part of the constitution that they all agreed to as well. And everybody was responsible for their own duties and obligations. But the Prophet, peace be upon him, they had chosen or elected as their main authority, their judicial, political authority in Medina. So they had all these communities had agreed that anything to do with law, anything to do with politics would be referred back to the Prophet, peace be upon him. Now, Ibn Ishaq ibn Sa'd, and this is where we talk about the Ghazwa of Banu Qaynuqa, a very controversial one, and many people use this to attack Islam as well. Now, there was a clan, Jewish clan called Banu Qaynuqa. They had a treaty with the Prophet, peace be upon him, the Muslims. They broke that treaty, and they fought against him at the Battle of Badr and the Battle of Uhud. Very important battles. They actually broke their treaty, and they fought against the Muslims as well. According to Al-Waqidi and Al-Zahabi, in other places they mentioned that there was an altercation, a fight broke out, and between a Jew and a Muslim, and the Muslim was actually killed. Right? He basically, what he did was, according to these scholars, is that a Jewish person, he stealthily pinned a Muslim woman's skirt to the back of her upper garment, so that when she stood up, she exposed herself. So this was, a bit of immoral behavior on their part as well. And so, because of breaking the treaties and fighting against the Muslims when they had agreed not to and to work with the Muslims, and the Prophet besieged this clan, what is called the Ghazwa Banu Qaynuqa, and they were deported from Medina without fighting, in accordance with what is the custom. This was a custom of the Arabs actually. So this isn't something, in fact, you can find references for this in Western literature as well. So this is just a summary of Banu Qaynuqa, and I can go into detail at some other point, but this is very, very important. The next one is another incident by Amr ibn Umayyah al-Damari from the Jewish clan of Banu Nadir. He killed 2 men from the clan of Banu Amir, and the Prophet went to the man's clan, asking that you need to pay blood money. You kill someone, you need to pay blood money for these 2 men. And this was in accordance with agreements. The Prophet was fulfilling and sticking to the agreements throughout, and the Muslims were doing this as well. Now, the Banu Nazir actually plotted to assassinate the Prophet, peace be upon him, as well. And there are many references to this as well, that they had, the Banu Nazir, so we moved on from Banu Qaynuqa, the Banu Nazir had planned to assassinate the Prophet as well. And so he said, you need to evacuate Medina, right? And because they violated, again, the constitution and the agreement that they had as well. And so the Prophet, they refused, and so and to comply, and they actually announced hostility. And so the Prophet marched and besieged them until they were deported from Medina. And you can understand this today, like, you know, if you have an agreement with the government, like you live in the country, you're a citizen of the state, you know, and you basically have an implicit agreement that you will follow the laws of the land. But if you start turning against the country, then the country has to do something against you because you're a threat to the stability of that nation. So they were deported from Medina without any fighting. And so this is called the ghazwa of Banu Nazir. Again, very, very important as well. And Medina has a long history, by the way, of internecine struggle as well. In fact, even before Islam, one of the leaders of Medina, Amr ibn Anuman, he actually fought himself. This is before Muslims came to Medina, of deporting the Nazir tribes and Qurayza, actually, because they had hostility towards the Arabs themselves, so not just towards Muslims, but Arabs themselves in Medina. And this is mentioned by a number of authors as well. So you can find, I can give you all these references if you want to reach out to me privately. So because of that deportation from Medina to Khaybar, a group from the Banu Nazir, now remember the Banu Nazir had been deported because of their treachery, they went to the Quraysh, and they actually, this is very, very interesting, they urged them to join in war against the Prophet, right? So they were very much determined to, you know, kill the Prophet, peace be upon him. And so they received 4,000 men from Quraysh in support, and this is the ghazwa of Ahzab I'm talking about. And they invited other tribes, the Ghatafan tribes, the Banu Sulaym tribes, the Banu Fazara tribes, the Ashra tribes, many other ones. And they made an army of around 10,000 men to attack the Muslims. And this is called the Ghazwa of Al-Ahzab, and it's mentioned in the Quran as well. Ahzab means parties. Various parties came together to seek out and to kill the Muslim community. So again, this is another example of them coming to attack the Muslims as well. It's also called the Ghazwa of the Ditch, because the Muslims had actually dug a trench around Medina, and I'll talk about this in much more detail in future videos as well. I'm just providing a concept of how to understand some of these battles as well. And and they besieged Medina for a fortnight. For around 2 weeks, they had besieged. These clans had come. One of them was the very one that had betrayed the Muslims, right? And then so the Banu Qurayza, the context for the Banu Qurayza, I'm just going to go back to the Banu Qurayza again. They supported the attackers at the Battle of the Ditch, right? And in fact, when they had agreed with the Muslims to stay on the sides of the Muslims, so they had broken their treaty, and not only had they broken their treaty, but in fact, they had turned against the very people they'd made an agreement with, right? This is treachery of the nth degree. One is to break a treaty, but worse, much worse, is to then turn against the people you've made an agreement with and just broken agreement with them. So the Prophet besieged their fortresses for around 2 weeks after the Battle of Ahzab, and they chose someone called Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, who was their ally. He was actually their ally of the Banu Qurayza, this Jewish tribe, to arbitrate in this dispute. The Prophet didn't arbitrate in this one. He gave the responsibility to Sa'd ibn Mu'adh. And in fact, Ibn Mu'adh, who was suffering from an arrow wound received in the Ghazwa himself, he actually died shortly afterwards. So he was called to arbitrate for them, and he decreed. So this wasn't a Prophet; their own law was applied for them. So he decreed that all the people who were able to fight should be put to death. This wasn't the Muslims applying the law; this was their own law that was being applied on them as well. And the sources give various numbers of who was killed in this battle. Some say 400, some say 600. In the sources, very, very interesting, there was no resistance to this. Like, they knew that they had broken the treaty. They knew that they had betrayed the Muslims, and they knew that this was a law that they had to follow because it was their own law that was being applied against them as well. So this is called the Ghazwa of Banu Qurayza. And it's very important, like I said, according to the rules of Banu Qurayza, they were their own text, their own law was being applied against them. This is the book of Deuteronomy 20, 10 to 15. Okay, so it's very important to bear this in mind. A lot of people miss this detail out. The Ghazwa of Khaybar is an interesting one, where the Prophet marched to Khaybar, a place called Khaybar, and because these people had agreed, the Prophet marched to Khaybar because they had joined in an attack at the Battle of the Ditch, of the one that we mentioned before. Now, most biographers just give the details of what happened here. And what happened was the Prophet was preaching, giving da'wah at Khaybar, when one among the group of fighters declaimed some verses of poetry about himself, calling for warriors to fight him. Come and fight me. And so in the Dabaqat genre, it's mentioned that the Prophet told Ali to fight against Khaybar until they believed that there's no God but God, and the Prophet Muhammad is the messenger of God, right? So this is some detail as well. Now another one is the Banu Mustalik. And the Prophet received news that Haris, a person called Haris ibn Abi Zirar, was gathering the clan of Banu Mustalik to fight against the Prophet, peace be upon him. So what the Prophet did was, as always, was he sent someone to check out to verify the news. Is this true? I've heard this rumor that someone wants to attack Muslims and kill Muslims, as is always happening, right? But we need to find out if it's true. We don't want to fight with somebody or engage in something when we don't know the facts on the ground. So the Prophet sent Buraidah ibn al-Husayb al-Aslami to verify the news. Very, very important. So when Buraidah confirmed that Haris was preparing for war, the Prophet went out against him, and there was some fighting. One Muslim is said to have been killed, and some people from the Banu Mustalik as well. So that's another battle. The next one is very, very interesting, which is the Ghazwa of Hudaybiyah, and many of the fuqaha, many of the jurists actually look at this one in a lot of detail. It's very important. And the Ghazwa of Hudaybiyah is an important one. This isn't actually a battle that took place. Again, the word Ghazwa has a very broad meaning. So what the Prophet did was, peace be upon him, was he set out for Mecca to perform the Umrah, the minor pilgrimage. This was in the 6th year and Hijri, and he put on the ihram, the garment, the garb, so that even when the Quraysh saw the Muslims coming from Medina to Mecca, they would know that the Muslims are not coming to fight them because they don't have any fighting gear on them, right? So the Prophet was conscious of this as well. Around 8 miles from Mecca, it's worth visiting this place if you ever get a chance. Negotiation took place between the Muslims and the Prophet. Basically, they concluded a pact, an agreement. So no fighting took place as well. And according to it, it was a very long one, but according to this pact, the Prophet was not permitted to enter Mecca, right? Despite they had traveled this distance for Umrah in that year, but they could come in the following year. So they could come for Umrah in the following year. So they had to go back, basically. Now, it's very interesting in terms of how the Quraysh justified this move. Strategically, politically, they made this move because their refusal was that they had this fear that other Arabs might think that the Prophet had forced his way into Mecca, i.e. they weren't good at negotiating with the Prophet. Now, this pact of Hudaybiyah is a very historic one. It's a very important one. So in the future video, I'm going to go into some detail about it, right? There's a lot of lessons that we can learn about this as well. So the Quraysh felt that this was like a victory for them, like the Muslims had turned back, and look at us, like look how powerful we are. Like the Muslims, they can't go for their minor pilgrimage, but they never knew what God had planned. So there was an armistice for 10 years, no fighting for 10 years, peace, and anyone who wanted to form an alliance with him or with the Quraysh can do so, right? So the clan of Banu Khuza'a, for example, they formed an alliance with the Prophet. There's another tribe called Banu Bakr. they formed an alliance with the Quraysh. So these two tribes went their different ways as well. Now, only after 2 years, after the 2 years that this agreement had been made, the Quraysh broke this deal. They broke this armistice. Can you see again? The Muslims never break a deal, right? They stick to their honor. They honor their agreements. Just like we saw with the Banu Qurayza, Banu Qaynuqa, they broke their agreements with the Muslims. Again, here you find that the Quraysh broke this agreement by arming and fighting with the clan of Banu Bakr. Remember, the Banu Bakr had now made an alliance with the Muslims. They had made an alliance with the Quraysh and Banu Khuza'a, right? And so there was some vendetta between them. And the Prophet was now like, look, you've broken the treaty. We made an agreement at Hudaybiyah. You've broken that treaty. We never broke it. So the Prophet marched in what's called ghazwa Fath Makkah to take control of Makkah. Right, you guys, you can't fulfill your agreements. And this is actually mentioned in chapter 48 of the Quran. It's called Al-Fath, the victory. And actually, this agreement that the Muslims made at Hudaybiyah, it's called Al-Fath Mubina. Inna fatahna alaka fatham mubina. This agreement between the Muslims and the Quraysh, which was largely in favor of the Quraysh and against the Muslims, God refers to as a victory for the Muslims. So this teaches us that we should never just see outward things. We should look at the deeper things to understand that there are hidden messages, and God knows when things are right for Muslims, right? And so in this 2 years after the ceasefire, right? In fact, I want to mention something very important here. It's a tangential point, but I think it's a very important point. The Muslims had a 10-year agreement of peace with the Quraysh. The Quraysh broke that agreement within 2 years. The Muslims never broke it. They broke the agreement. What happened in those 2 years in terms of people who became Muslims in this period of peace, in this period of stability? Very, very interesting. So I want to add here that the number of Arabs, people who had embraced Islam over the period of the first 19 years, this was far outnumbered. So in the first 19 years of Islam, the number of people that had embraced Muslim was insignificant compared to the amount of Muslims the amount of people who became Muslims in just those 2 years of peace. In those 2 years of peace, when Muslims followed their agreement, they fulfilled their agreements, they honored their agreements, even though it was difficult for them, Allah gave them victory by making more people become Muslim in a state of peace, right? So, Muslims accompanied the Prophet at Hudaybiyah in the 6th year of Hijri, 19 years after the advent of Islam, right? Not the 1,400, they say 1,400 with the Prophet at Hudaybiyah. Within 2 years, when the Prophet went to Mecca, so 1,400 were the amount of Muslims that came with the Prophet at Hudaybiyah. 2 years later, this is all they had. This was the number of Muslims that were there. Within 2 years of that agreement, within 2 years of them, the Quraysh, breaking that agreement, right? Some scholars say that the number reached, this is in the 8th year of Hijri, 10 or 12,000, just in 2 years, okay? Ibn Ishaq mentions that no previous victory in Islam was greater than this, right? There was nothing, there was no battles, right? And people just met each other. People just met Muslims, right? And there was an armistice, there was no war, and people just became Muslims just by meeting Muslims. Right? So this teaches a very important moral lesson, very important lesson for us to reflect upon that. When there's peace, there's justice, and Muslims honor their agreements, they fulfill their agreements, Allah gives them success, Allah gives them victory. And people entered Islam. Just this was the religion that they wanted. This was the lifestyle that they wanted. This is what they felt was right for them. There was no force. Okay. In fact, Karen Armstrong, who's a wonderful writer, by the way, in her book, considered Treaty of Hudaybiyah a turning point. She actually says this is a turning point, which really set the Muslims apart from everybody else as well. And so there was no war, normal relations. People came together. Right. In fact, Donner, in his book, so I have his book here actually, worth reading if you ever get a chance. This book, The Early Conquests, the Islamic Early Conquests. He actually says this truce is a turning point in the Prophet's life that brought about political power and prestige. Right. So this is really significant in the life of the Prophet as well. A few more, and I'll end here, inshallah. This lecture is a bit longer than usual. After the Prophet entered Makkah in the 8th year of Hijri, a person called Malik ibn Auf al-Ansari, he gathered a group of people, Hawazin, and these are the final few ghazawat, to fight the Prophet, right? To fight the Muslims as well. And they marched to fight at Hunayn. And the Prophet went there. He sent Abdullah ibn Hadrat al-Aslami to confirm the news, right? And that they fought, and this is another battle that's called Battle of Hunayn as well. I'm not going to go into the detail. Another one is the Ghazwa of Ta'if, where 12 Muslims were shot dead by arrows as well. So this was another battle as well. The final one that I want to just quickly talk about is the Ghazwa of Tabuk, where the Prophet marched to a place called Tabuk to confront. This was where there was no battle. He just marched there to confront the Byzantines, Lakham, Judam, Ghassan, and Amila, who were gathering to attack him. Syrian traders had brought this news that, and they told the Muslims that they reached a place called Al-Balqa, and they were camping there. But this was just a rumor. So again, the Prophet would always clarify things. So this is just a broad lesson for us, that we always clarify things, especially in our social media age, where people just spread rumors as well. And so there was no confrontation here. But it's also, but though there was no fighting or there was no confrontation, the scholars still classify as a ghazwat, right? Because there was a potential there as well. So these are just some of the 27 ghazawat of the Prophet. Not everyone did he fight in. In almost all of them, they launched an offensive against the Muslims. They are the ones who came to attack the Muslims. They are the ones who broke their agreement. Muslims honored their agreements. Muslims honored their treaties. And this is very, very important to bear in mind, because it was about da'wah, it was about making treaties, it was about peace, finding peace. The Muslims agreed to peace whenever they could find peace. And this is something that I think a lot of people are scared to talk about. So I hope this lecture, which is longer than usual, has been useful. And I'll stop there because it is prayer time. And I can only supplicate and pray to God that people are guided, and this becomes a means of guidance for myself, and that we increase in our love for our Prophet, for our faith, and that we can teach our faith and explain our faith in an intellectually honest, robust, fearless way to our fellow human beings. Until next time, stay safe. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.